Welcome to this lecture where we will be exploring a little bit about science in general and the study of the human brain in particular. Within this class, we will be looking a lot at the history of the brain, its context, how we understand the physicality of the brain, and learn a little bit of vocabulary. Now, you will be learning a lot of terms that you've probably never heard before in general conversation. But these terms are invaluable for understanding and conversing about the brain and the human experience. The definitions of the vocabulary are important for you to learn because within the definitions is the foundational knowledge that you will require to understand what is going on in your own head. The first thing that I want to be clear about is that the brain and the mind are not necessarily the same thing. When I speak of brain, I mean the physical, observable structure of that cauliflower-looking organ in your head. When I speak of the mind, I am speaking of your thoughts and the content and flow of thought. It's really amazing that this organ of the brain and how it relates to the mind is something that we continue to discover the depths of, and that we are really truly fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, because it has not always been believed that the brain was important for basic human functioning, and that it hasn't always been recognized that the mind and the brain work together and are connected for perceiving the world or for cognition and forming thoughts and ideas, I want to take a little bit of time and look at the history of ideas about the mind and the essence of what it means to be human. And we need to look at how we came to recognize the importance of the brain in order to really understand and appreciate the role that psychology has played and neuroscience has played, and the mishmash of sciences that have gone into the study of the brain. The study of the brain really is an interdisciplinary field, and you can be a specialist in, things like cellular biology or chemistry or psychology or quantum physics or bioelectricity or medical imaging or psychiatry or philosophy, and they all connect to neuroscience. And in addition, philosophy really influences our understanding of the human mind, which influences and informs our interpretation of the mind and the brain relationship and the meaning of what it means to be human. But the scientific method is always essential in that whole process. And as we look at the historical views and understand the major paradigms that go into our understanding of the mind and the brain, I hope you recognize that we have come from a place of real obscurity, and we have moved to a place of incredible depth of understanding, and yet there is so much more that we need to learn. Now, according to some neuroscientists, many ancient cultures viewed the heart as the seat of human experience. And it was also considered the seat of cognition, that is, thought, the seat of perception, experiencing that which is outside the body, and the seat of emotion. Now, I can tell you from my own research that the heart is a highly integrated organ when it comes to the brain. The brain and the heart are inextricably linked in many ways because they talk to each other. And there are dozens of assessments about the environment relating to perception and assessment of danger in the external world that go on every second and every millisecond. You can also measure from the heart-brain conversation via some electrical impulses and the bioelectrical spectrum a reflection of what a person is thinking about. So the heart is linked with cognition. Again, emotion. The feeling state of the individual is intimately linked with the heart. In fact, one of the best predictors of myocardial infarction, that is, a heart attack, is related to the biochemistry of emotional disorders. In essence, as goes a person's emotional state, so goes the heart. So, it is not without good reason that ancient cultures viewed the heart as an important factor in human experience. So it's not without good reason that ancient cultures viewed the heart as an important factor in human experience. By contrast, little was known about the brain, and therefore a lot of cultures considered it to not be important. If we go back, way back in culture, at the time following the great pharaohs of Egypt, pharaohs like Moses, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ramses, following this time around 1000 BC, when they died, their brains were extracted through their noses and the brains were discarded. By contrast, the organs that were viewed, and if we can use this as a gauge of what they viewed as important to the afterlife, were things like the liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines were all preserved. And these were preserved in what we now call carnopic jars. And these jars were capped at the top with images of the heads of gods of the Egyptian pantheon, really in order to signify their importance. And these jars were made of alabaster. And the heart was considered to have an extremely central place in the eventual resurrection of the pharaoh. So it was not extracted from the body and was left in place to be mummified by the process of dehydrating the body by filling it with salts and herbs to preserve it. Now, many interpret this as meaning that the pharaoh could enter the afterlife without a brain, but required his heart because it was central to who he was. Now, within the Book of the Dead, we see rituals that highlight the importance of the heart. We see Anubis, who was the jackal-headed god of internment and the guardian of the sarcophagus. He led the dead to judgment. One of the images in this Book of Anubis, holding the scales, and on one side is the person's heart, and on the other was the feather of Ma'at. Now, Ma'at was the god of truth, justice, peace, and order in the universe. And this image can be interpreted as, in order for that individual to pass the judgment, their wrongdoings of the heart had to weigh less than that feather of Ma'at. And this belief of the centrality of the heart was not a belief that was exclusive to the ancient Egyptians. Ancient Greece viewed the heart to be of immense value, as well as viewed as central to the functioning of who a person is. And in addition, Asian traditions in India and China also hold the heart to have a central place within who a person is. In fact, the heart was also often viewed to be the seat of memory and intellect. It was also the seat of the soul of the individual. For example, Aristotle would influence science and philosophy for centuries. he considered the heart to be central to intellect. Now, to be fair, we often view these works in a mechanistic way that may not really fully grasp what Aristotle was saying, but still, it is fairly clear that within his philosophical system was the control of the passions of the heart. The heart was the seat of the important functions of the human life. That is, things like perception, cognition, and soul. And later, Galen rejected the idea that the heart was the seat of the soul and mind. But he did not let go of the idea that there were spirits that emanate from the heart and influence the mind. And at this time, the conventional wisdom was that there were spirits or fluids that moved around the body in complicated sort of hydraulic view. This does make a lot of sense, since we are indeed filled with fluids and water and blood and bile. And in Galen's view, the role of the brain was to make these spirits noble in character. Galen's ideas and theories are, or their variations, were to dominate really into the Renaissance. And from the Renaissance onward, the core of human thought and perception was localized to the head, if not specifically to the brain itself. Now, because the fluidic notions still somewhat dominated the view, the idea was that the fluids resided and moved around within the brain in cavities known as ventricles. So, if someone ever told you that you have holes in your head, well, that person was correct. We do have ventricles. Now, if we're to take a modern view of the ventricular system, we can see that there are indeed holes in a brain that fluids move around within. Many thinkers within the Renaissance believed that this was the seat of the mind and of the soul within the ventricular system. Not necessarily within the brain itself, but within this system of fluids. And one of the thinkers who held this view was Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci gave us some of the most accurate and beautiful descriptions of the ventricular systems of the brain. He believed that perception and cognition resided within these cavities, not in the brain substance itself. Again, we have this image of spirits flowing within our head. And there have been many philosophical influences upon neuroscience and the study of the brain, and this really is a subject unto itself. Likely the most influential of these is at the beginning foundations of modern philosophy with the French mathematician, bioresearcher, and philosopher René Descartes. His Latin name, Renatus Cartesius. So when you hear someone speak of a Cartesian way of thinking, they are speaking of René Descartes and his influences. Now, his name has become practically synonymous with dualism. And dualism is basically the idea that the mind and the body are distinct entities and are independent of each other. They are made of a different type of each other. It was an idea that was really begun by Plato before Christ, but it was best and most precisely elaborated by Descartes, and that is why he is so associated with it. He spoke of the bodies of animals and humans as immensely intricate clockworks, essentially complex machines that were driven, but he believed that the mind and the soul, and he used these terms interchangeably, he called it the rational soul. He felt this was found only in humans and could only be found within the rational soul. Now, he did believe that our bodies functioned similarly to that of animals, and he did believe that our bodies were amazing machines. The rational soul was the storehouse of our subjective sense of ourself and of cognition, and that which is essential to make me, me. Descartes could not imagine how we could think, and did not see how this could only be a function of our physical bodies. I think, therefore I am. However, Descartes did recognize that this rational soul and the body must interact. So he became fascinated with where this interaction took place. Now, in doing autopsies, he identified the pineal gland as the place where this interaction takes place. Now, why did he choose this? Well, in the brain, virtually the entire brain has two mirror sides to it. Now, the Greek physician Hippocrates identified that there was contralateralism in the brain. That is, when one side of the brain was damaged, there was a corresponding effect on the other side of the body. With the pineal gland, we have one of those places in the brain where there is a single, that is undivided with mirror images, structure within the brain. In addition, it was near the center of the brain and in the central region between the ventricles. So it made sense for Descartes to identify this as a place where there was the interaction between fluids and the brain. Experience of ourselves seems to be unitary, of one type. So Descartes was looking for one place. However, it has since been found that a person can function just fine without the pineal. So it's clearly not what Descartes thought it was. And just as a side note, we now know that the pineal is the main gland that produces something called melatonin, which is important in helping us fall asleep and in our overall health of the sleep-wake cycle. Now, from the 17th century onward, individual researchers began to believe that the brain itself was responsible for making us, for the role of cognition and perception and many of the functions previously attributed to the soul. Now, one of these researchers that came to this belief was the British anatomist Thomas Willis. And Willis was a physician that coined the term neurology and became the father of neurology, the field of study focusing on the study and function of the brain, and involved specifically with disorders of the brain. And a bit of trivia was that Willis was a member of a group working at Oxford at the time and referred to as the Oxford Group. And members of this group contributed enormously to areas of philosophy, to biochemistry, and a philosopher and physician among this group was John Locke, who believed that we are a sum of our experiences. And another individual that was part of this group was someone by the name of Christopher Wren, who was an architect and also a very accomplished artist. So, back to Willis. He was one of the first to describe many of the neurologic and psychiatric disorders. So, in 1664, he published something known as The Anatomy of the Brain and the Nerves. And this work helped to establish a common understanding that cognition, perception, and movement are all functions of the brain itself. Now, An important thing here is that Thomas Willis' descriptions of the brain were accompanied by beautiful drawings that were made by Christopher Wren. And the drawings shown within this text are so beautifully done that it could be mistaken for a photograph in any neuroanatomy textbook today. Now, any history of neuroscience would not be complete without a mention of Franz Joseph Gall, who clearly believed that the brain was the origin of the mind, and he postulated that there were approximately 35 mental functions that were located in the cortex. Moreover, he guessed or imagined or postulated that the development of the cortex below the skull would result in a change in the shape of the skull itself. This was called phrenology. We may have abandoned this, but I think that you should know that we do find that some very complex functions and emotions and compassion actually have areas of the brain that are pretty much devoted to those functions. So while we've thrown out the idea that the shape of the skull can tell us this or that about a person's personality, we do recognize that it is better to look at a person's behavior and draw our conclusions from that. Nevertheless, an established observation that the actual functioning and areas of the cortex are dedicated to these certain faculties is important. So while the means of phrenology to measure faculty was not accurate, the basic idea that it resides within the structure of the brain is in fact true. Now, after the death of Gall, the practice of experimentation in biological studies of the brain really took hold. And here the study went more or less like this. The researcher would produce a lesion or altogether remove a portion of the brain in an animal and then look at what function was lost. And this gave us a basic map for where functions were located within the brain. In humans, a good deal has been learned from individuals with things like traumatic brain injuries, where we can have a baseline of the type of person that individual was before and after a brain injury. In looking at the brain injury itself, we can deduce what functions were controlled by that area of the brain. Now, while we currently use this basic type of method to help us understand the function and connection of various areas of the brain, this very brief introduction gives us a great sense of the organization of the human brain. In particular, throughout history, physicians who treated injured soldiers told us a massive amount about the organization of the human brain. They kept journals that give particular homage to philosophy, that ask questions like, what do we know about the world and how do we know it? What is consciousness?